Okay, here we are in 1 Timothy chapter 3. In this chapter, we're getting a little bit more about a specific calling in the church as bishop. So let's get into this a little bit more, okay? We're getting more organization to the church. And so Paul's going to define some of these roles. So the title bishop is derived from the Greek word episcopos. Epi, which means over, as in the epicenter of an earthquake, or the spot over which the quake centers, epi, okay, and scopos, meaning look or watch. Therefore, an episcopos, or bishop, is one who watches over the flock as an overseer or supervisor. That's bishop, okay? Overseer or supervisor, somebody who looks over the flock, who takes care of the flock and loves them and treats them well and is kind to them and guides them and helps them. They're the hireling in the stories. When Jesus says there's the shepherd and then there's the hireling. The bishops are hirelings. They're not the shepherd, but they're there to represent the shepherd, basically. So let's get here. In verse 1, this is a true saying, if a man desire the office of bishop, he desireth a good work. A bishop then must be blameless. So this is now the requirements. The husband of one wife, so no polygamy, vigilant, sober, of good report, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy and filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. We're going to talk about that in a second. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? That's why he needs to learn how to rule his own house. So he needs to understand principles of governance. Verse 6, not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into condemnation of the devil. That's all one sentence right there. Verses 2 through 6, one sentence. So let's talk about this a little bit more now. In verse 2, okay, blameless, husband of one wife. Now, a lot of people use this and they really argue against, like, oh, but the LDS church had bishops that had multiple wives in the polygamy years and things. Yes, now the language doesn't necessarily say only. You have to have at least one wife. Could be another way to look at that. So you can't rule out polygamy all the way, but it's not advocating polygamy either in there as well. So, and some, again, people are interpreting the scriptures to argue their point. And that's not the way to look at the scriptures. We got to be careful with that. Now, when it talks about given to hospitality, let's bring this up for just a second. Hospitality was an important attribute according to the ancient societies. Wayment in his book, The New Testament, mentions that. So be hospitable, which means inviting. You don't have to be throw lots of parties, but be inviting. Be welcoming to people. Be a good host. Whether that's at home, whether that's at church, be a host, make it inviting for people to come. So a bishop who is excluding people, that's not being hospitable. We need to be more inclusive and hospitable to people. So I want to be careful with that. Apt to teach is good, of good behavior, sober, vigilant, so striving to keep the commandments, working hard on those things is good. Not given to wine or striker, not given to, which is like temptations and things. Not greedy, a filthy lucre, so you can't be like love money type ideas, but be patient, not a brawler, so no violence, and not covetous, not seeking other people's goods and things like that. Verse 4 is always an interesting one. Not one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. The word subjection is the one that a lot of people have a hard time with. Because a lot of people believe in subjection means the man needs to be in power. Okay, we use the worldly term of power to interpret this verse. And I'm not sure that's the right way to think about this. Because the worldly version of power is not the kind of power even Christ talks about. Okay, when Christ talks about subjection or being in authority over people, he doesn't use that definition. So the worldly definition of power is, I have the ability to make a choice that you have to suffer the consequence of. That's the world's version of power. I make the choice, you live with the consequence of it. Okay? If I have a military, you have to do what I say, otherwise my military will kill you. That's worldly power. If I make the laws and you have to deal with the laws, that's worldly power. If I can overpower you, if I'm holding the weapon and you're not, you do what I say because I'm threatening to injure you and cause problems for you that you're not asking for. So that's the worldly definition is I can make a choice that negatively impacts you. You have to live with it regardless, but I'm the one that makes the choice. That's worldly power. That is not anywhere what Christ talks about in his teachings. What he talks about as power is the opportunity to create influence with other people. Now, what this means is Christ, of course, Christ didn't make anybody. If you look at the power that Christ has, yes, Christ has power, his priesthood authority to, walk on water, to make fish appear out of nowhere, to feed people in miraculous ways. He has power to make changes to things that we don't have the ability to do. But he's not using that power for himself. He's not using that to hurt people. His real power, the real power that Christ had, was his ability to let people use their own agency, to either follow him or not. In the gospel, that is the real power, okay? In priesthood authority, that is the real power. Your job as a priesthood leader isn't to tell people what they need to be doing. Your job as a priesthood leader is help people see the choice they have to make, but let them use their agency to make it. We don't follow Christ because he makes us, because he threatens us. We follow Christ because we choose to follow him. That is the difference. And so I think that's what he's talking about here. If we take verse 4 in context of the rest of the gospel, having his children in subjection with all gravity means not that his children are blindly following the dad because the dad is threatening them. They follow the dad because they choose to follow someone who loves them. That, I think, is what he really means here. If we take this in the context of the rest of the New Testament teachings, that's what it needs to be there. If your children will follow you by choice, they listen to you, they heed your counsel because they choose to, not because you make them. You understand how to rule and how to govern, which is in verse 5. If you can govern in small ways, you can take those principles and govern in larger areas as well. That's what I believe he's really getting at here. So the principle of doing things small is the same as doing larger. It's just a larger scale. When you understand the principles, then you can scale it up. And that's verse 5, basically. I really think that's what he's getting at here. That's the important point to look at. Now in verse 7, so let's continue on here. Moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without. Now this is really interesting. Okay? Lest he fall into reproach and the devil snare and the snare of the devil. So the concern, Wayment says, the concern regarding what outsiders will think about Christian bishops may indicate growth in the church and greater visibility. Have a good report of them that are without. Does the leader have a reputation among non-members that would be a good thing? Would non-members look at that leader and go, if he's the leader, maybe I should consider joining. I feel safe and comfortable going there because he is the leader. Or do people look at the leader and go, I am not showing up so long as he is the leader? That is a big difference. That's the thing we have to be careful with in our leadership. Again, and I think that goes back to that same idea we talked about in verse 4. If you are leading in a way that allow people to have their own agency, they choose to follow you, you're going to be a better leader. If they have to follow you, that's not a good leadership rule. That's the thing we have to be looking at. I think that's a very powerful leadership principle for us to consider, is looking at this, okay? Now, verse 8, he talks about another calling in the church. Likewise, must the deacons be grave, not dead, but like solemn, not double-tongued, meaning you don't lie, don't two-face it, not given to much wine. Bishop said no wine, deacons not much wine, so a little less lenient or less strict, not greedy of filthy lucre, so very similar to the bishops, holding the mystery of the faith in a pure conscience. Now let's talk about the word deacon for just a second here. The word deacon comes from a Greek word meaning servant or minister. Okay, the office of deacon seems to have been a preparatory one because Paul did not prohibit a novice. Remember that bishops, you can't be a novice, verse 6. But deacons, there's no requirement. So you can be a novice and be a deacon. Or like a recent convert, basically. So from being called a deacon, but did prohibit novice from being called as a bishop. So deacons are a little less strict than the bishop, but it is a very important role, still valuable to have. Now, most of the time in the New Testament, when you see the word deacon or minister or servant of God or servant of apostles or things like that, the Greek word that's used for deacon is oftentimes found there. Sometimes in the scriptures, we've mentioned this in the past when this comes up, sometimes Paul refers to women using the same Greek word for deacon, calling those women as if they are deacons or servants or ministers. There are some people, more predominantly in the pro-feminist movements, that will say that, does that imply then that women held priesthood authority in the ancient church? I don't think we can 100% rule that out, but I think the challenge is there's other than this assumption that they use the word deacon to talk about women doing things in the church, but that word deacon can mean servant just as much as minister. So we have to look at, is he talking servant or minister there? And there's not enough evidence to show that he's talking about women as ministers. So most likely he's talking to women as servants, helpers in the church, but not the leaders of the church. So they use the word deacon in the New Testament a lot to talk about women's work in the church. But that doesn't mean that we cannot take the assumption that women had the priesthood and had priesthood authority. It had an office in the priesthood, I should say, at that time. They all have all callings, all roles in the church have priesthood authority because it all is working under the authority of God. But to say that women had an office in the priesthood because of them using that word for deacon isn't something that can be 100% definitively proved. I can't say we can rule it out, but we can't say it's 100% provable either. So it kind of leave in that suspension area for that. But I just want to point that out just for clarification on that. Now let's continue on here, verse 10, and let these also first be proved, then let them use the office of a deacon, being found blameless. So this is important. Okay, you kind of have to be deacon, and then you can be a bishop afterwards type ideas. So deacon's more preparatory, bishop's a little bit more higher up one. Verse 11, even so must their wives be grave, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. So again, now these are the wives of the deacons. They need to be upstanding members of the church as well. Verse 12, let the deacons be the husbands of one wife, ruling their children and their own house as well. It's similar to the bishops. For they that have used the office of a deacon well purchase to themselves a good degree, and great boldness in the faith which is in Christ Jesus. So that's what he's getting at here, is being temperate, being vigilant, being able to, and when he says deacons well purchased in verse 13, it's not that you can buy an office, but you earn that office, or you are worthy of that office, basically. Now let's talk about verse 15 and 16 for a second here. But if I tarry long, verse 14, these things I write unto thee, hoping to come unto thee shortly. So Paul's hoping I can come to where Timothy is to work with him. But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. So Paul's, hey, Timothy, I want to come to you, but if I don't, this is good advice. This letter is going to give you good advice to help you out. And he's giving him here in verse 16, the understanding the mysteries of God. So here's what it says. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. Let's talk about these for a second here. In the oldest manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, it reads, who was made manifest in the flesh. So instead of it saying God was manifest in the flesh, it says God who was made manifest in the flesh. So it might have been changed in later manuscripts to emphasize Christ's divinity to go against those who thought he was just a human. Remember, in early Christianity, okay, before the big controversies they had at the beginning of Christianity, around the time of Constantine, as they're trying to establish a legitimate Christian church, because there was different opinions and ideas, that different variations of doctrine and teachings within Christianity at the time. So when Constantine said, no, we're going to make Christianity a legitimate religion, it's going to be the state religion, we have to know what is orthodox, which is the truth, and what is Gnostic, which is the false. And so they tried to do this. This is the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Trent, and all these things in early Christianity. One of the big challenges they had was, how do we understand the divinity of Christ? Was Christ divine and human, or was that two separate individuals? There were lots of debates about this. This is why in the Greek Orthodox Church, if you go to one of those, a Greek Orthodox church like the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Ukrainian church, these more Baltic type churches, in their depictions of Jesus, it looks as if Jesus, if you draw a line down the middle of Jesus's face, one eye will be bigger than the other. He might smile on one side, might not be smiling on the other side. One side of him will look more animated, the other side won't, because they believed that Jesus was human, but there was a Jesus spirit that inhabited human body, and they were separate. So in Greek Orthodox ideas, Jesus was a man. When he got baptized, the Spirit entered him, and he was divine. But then just before Jesus died on the cross, the Spirit left him, therefore the mortal body died, but the Spirit went. So there's a duality of Christ. On the more, what Constantine and his group called the Orthodox side, which is where Catholicism comes from, Jesus is both. It's all combined into one. He's divine and mortal. Bam, it's all combined into one. It's not separated out. So that's part of these challenges. And so what's interesting is this shows, because early manuscripts show this as written different, so we can point to this and say there's a good chance that a later scribe who's going through the Bible went, I need to change this so it makes it easier to justify my religion's beliefs. That is a change. So there's a contradiction in here. Okay? A scribe changed the Bible to prove their beliefs. Not following the truth, but prove their beliefs. They want their interpretation to be the right interpretation, so they're going to tweak the Bible to adjust that. This is one area where that's pretty clear that happened, okay? So we have to understand this, okay? Because if we read it in the older manuscripts, God, comma, who was made manifest in the flesh versus God was manifest in the flesh. There's some different subtleties in there, and people are, this is, this points back to the challenge of, is the Bible completely the Word of God, absolutely true, and there's no more truth? No. We can even show in the manuscripts, this was changed from the original. It was later changed from the original to reinterpret what the Bible meant in this verse. So there have been changes. So that's important for us to be looking at, okay? Now, Joseph Smith actually adjusts in his translation verses 15 and 16 as well. So let's talk about these. Verse 15, he says, But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God. The pillar and ground of the truth is, and without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was made manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. So a little different, just a little different ideas in there. that this is, in fact, he moves the pillar and ground of the truth from verse 15 to verse 16. He switches that down there and kind of changes it a little bit, but it matches up, emphasizing the pillar and ground of truth is Jesus Christ. You see that change? So it's not the church is the pillar and ground of truth. It's that Jesus is the pillar and ground of truth, who is God made manifest in flesh. That's more the emphasis that Joseph Smith puts on those with his translation as well. So some important things that we've learned in this letter to Timothy from Paul, some important things to look at, to consider as we continue our gospel study. Let's jump over to the next chapter as we continue this letter.